If you live in the US, Canada, Australia, or any other nation that was founded by settlers, chances are the city, town, or village you live in is only a few centuries old, with very few exceptions. Even if we go to the quote-unquote old world in places like Europe, most cities are not that much older than a millennium. Most trace their history back to the Middle Ages, or at the very least the earliest of classical antiquity. However, there are a few regions in the world, namely the Middle East, where cities are well over 3,000 years old. Now keep in mind that the cities on the list are not necessarily the oldest cities in human history. There may be many cities that are actually older than the ones named, but they are no longer inhabited, and therefore will not be included. There are also cities that have moved in and out of habitation, like Jericho in the Palestinian territories, which I also won't include, but probably deserve a video on their own. I also want to point out, before I start the list, that dating this far back in time is quite tricky, and a lot of these cities will have foundations that aren't necessarily set at a specific year, but rather a general range. So first on the list is going to be Damascus, which is the current capital of Syria. Now, when you usually hear about Damascus today, it's probably in reference to the Syrian civil war that ended recently, which had started back in 2010. And while the modern history of this city is incredibly depressing, its past was a lot brighter. Damascus is arguably the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. It's really difficult to tell when this area was first settled though, but some archaeologists attest that it is over 12,000 years old, which would indeed make it the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. However, keep in mind that it wasn't until around 3000 BC, which is roughly 5,000 years ago, when we really had a good understanding of the settlements in the area of what is now Damascus. Like many ancient cities, this was located around a river, known as the Barara River. Obviously, it would be difficult to have a large-scale city at the time without easy access to fresh water. Given the fact that this was at a time when sieges and conquests were the norm, the geography of Damascus, situated on a plateau with mountains nearby, added some nearby protection. Earliest references to the city by and large date back to Egyptian and Hittite records. The ancient Egyptians and Hittites were two Bronze Age powers that were clashing in the Levant region nearby Damascus, at a time when Damascus wasn't particularly grandiose. However, while the Egyptian and Hittite civilizations would fall during the Bronze Age collapse, Damascus would thrive in the aftermath during the Iron Age. This may be the reason why many of you have probably heard of Damascus if you've ever read the Old Testament of the Bible. Both Damascus and the ancient state of Israel would succumb to the conquest of the brutal Neo-Assyrian Empire for a period of time. However, due to the mass destruction, we really don't know too much about what was going on in the city in the aftermath. Eventually, there would be a great deal of Greek influence due to Alexander the Great, and later the Romans would take over the city. The Romans were expert engineers and set up a great deal of infrastructure. However, the most famous person during the Roman period would be St. Paul, who would convert to Christianity on the road to Damascus. However, the city would not remain predominantly Christian for long, as a new religion to the south would emerge called Islam, 600 years later, that would spread rapidly throughout the region. When Muhammad's initial successors, the Rashiduns, had lost their power due to infighting, the Umayyad Caliphate would emerge and make it the central capital, not Mecca, Medina, but Damascus. To this day, Damascus is considered the fourth holiest city in Islam after Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, and it would eventually be taken over by the Abbasids, who would rule from Baghdad, and then by the Turks, and then by other forces, before eventually being granted independence under the French Mandate. However, the history since then has been overwhelmingly depressing. So let's move on to another city nearby, called Byblos. Dating back to 5000 BC, Byblos is in modern-day Lebanon, and is arguably the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. There is some debate as to whether Damascus or Byblos is the oldest continuously inhabited city. For those of you who don't know, I'm originally Lebanese, so I have a bit of a stake in this, but I'm going to put national identity aside and look at the much grander archaeological evidence, which at the end of the day is inconclusive. So I think a more accurate representation is that it's either Damascus or Byblos that are the oldest continuously inhabited cities. What is more important than nationalistic dick swinging is the actual legacy of the city itself. It has been passed around by the ancient Canaanites, Egyptians, the Phoenicians, who are by and large seen as the precursors of Lebanese people and the peak of their civilization, followed by the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Turks, Crusaders, Turks again, the French, and then the modern independent state of Lebanon. It was the most famous during the Phoenician era, as the Phoenicians were a maritime people group traveling around the Mediterranean, trading their purple dyes for other items around the world, even going as far as Britain and West Africa, spreading their alphabet, which is the basis of the Greek alphabet, which in turn is the basis of the Latin alphabet that we use today. The word Bible most likely traces its origins to the word Byblos, since the Phoenicians were well known for writing on papyrus, which was probably used by the Greeks to write early biblical texts. Next on the list is going back to Syria, the city of Aleppo. Dating back roughly to 5000 BCE. Again, these dates are debatable. The city is not as old as Damascus, but it's still incredibly old. But unlike Damascus, you probably haven't heard about it that much outside of the crisis of the Syrian civil war. Now, this is not a video about modern geopolitics. The city was first inhabited by a group of Semitic peoples known as the Amorites. However, its culture quickly switched hands to various people groups over the course of time. It was prominent during the classical era under the Romans, and later became a major cultural hotspot during the Islamic Golden Age. At one point, it was actually considered to be one of the endpoints of the Silk Road. This city also has some of the most magnificent buildings in the world, but unfortunately much of it has been destroyed over the course of the Syrian civil war, primarily due to the Russian Air Force working on behalf of the Syrian government at the time against the Free Syrian Army. Moving on to another city that is totally not controversial and will not ignite a firestorm in the comments if there are any comments in this video, and that is Jerusalem in Israel and the Palestinian territories. The scale of this city's importance, culturally and historically, is immense, dating back to the ancient era all the way to current modern day events. Now, from a secular, archaeological, and historical perspective, the ancient Judeans probably did not escape Egypt, but more accurately emerged organically within the region itself, forming two separate kingdoms, Judea and Israel. Jerusalem is located in Judea, whereas the capital of the ancient state of Israel was Sumeria. The Bible is actually written from a Judean perspective. The Judeans would build their first temple under King Solomon, according to the Bible. However, it's difficult to tell to what extent this is true from a secular historical perspective. Unfortunately, this temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and many of the elite Jews were sent to Babylon before they were liberated by the Persian Empire. This was around the time period in which the Jews developed monotheism, and would eventually build the Second Temple. This would be the center of Jewish life and the foundation of the Jewish religion today. They would even liberate themselves from Greek rule later on, and this is where the story of Hanukkah comes from. However, they would later be subjugated by the Romans, and in the aftermath of Jesus' death, the Jews would revolt against Roman rule, which would result in the Romans taking over Jerusalem and burning down many of the incredibly important cultural monuments. Today, one of the last vestiges of the old city is the Western Wall. Power in Jewish circles moved away from the temple elites to the Pharisees, who would eventually morph into the rabbis. Eventually, the city would become predominantly Christian, and would later be taken over by the Muslims, and then the Christians again during the Crusades, and then the Muslims again. The last Islamic power were the Ottoman Turks, which collapsed during World War I, and then the British Mandate of Palestine would be created for a brief period of time before a UN resolution would split the British Mandate into Israel and the Palestinian territories, which unfortunately led to the Arab-Israeli wars, a subject that I am not going to delve into given the current shit show. So I'm going to move on to a less controversial city, Luxor. Dating back to 2150 BCE, again a rough estimate. This city is in Upper Egypt. Keep in mind that when I say upper, I'm not referring to the north, but rather in terms of the river. So it's actually in southern Egypt. This was close to the fabled, well, really not fabled, but grandiose historical city of Thebes, on one side of the bank of the river the Nile. This was where ancient Egyptian elites would build their coolest monuments, and where you would see the coolest political and cultural achievements of much of ancient Egypt. Unfortunately, much of the power dynamics would eventually switch to Alexandria during the Classical Age and later to Cairo during the Middle Ages, which still exists to this day. And hey, the modern nation state of Egypt is actually planning a new capital city, so it's probably going to change from this point on, but that city is nowhere near as cool as Luxor. Now, obviously, the modern nation state of Egypt is vastly detached culturally from ancient Egyptian culture, but nonetheless, these monuments still captivate people from all around the world. And it's even inspired a hotel in Las Vegas, which in my opinion is way cooler than the Pyramid of Memphis, Tennessee, which was also inspired by the Egyptian city of Memphis. Next on the list is Jaffa, dating back to 2000 BC, the oldest section of the city of Tel Aviv in Israel. Now, as I stated before, this is not about modern geopolitics. This is about ancient history. Now, if you read the Bible, you will notice that many of the cities mentioned by and large do not exist on the Mediterranean coast, but more inland. Jaffa is one of the exceptions. After all, it's kind of hard to run a city on a saltwater body rather than, say, a freshwater body at that time. But nonetheless, this city did provide a gateway to the external world through shipping. If you've ever read the story of Jonah, the story of the guy who got swallowed up by a giant fish or a whale, which to be clear is historically dubious, you probably heard that the city of Jaffa was used as a port, which he took to arrive at what was at that point the furthest known destination of the known world, which was most likely in Spain. The city would also be the source of conquest for many a conqueror, be it Saladin to Napoleon. Next on the list is the city of Beirut. It is the modern-day capital of the nation of Lebanon, and one of the most religiously diverse cities in the world, with an origin dating back to Canaanite times, even becoming relatively prominent compared to other cities, but not quite as prominent as other Phoenician city-states such as Tyre and Sidon. It would eventually be passed around by various empires, and during the Ottoman Empire during the 1800s, it would become the largest city in what is now Lebanon. The nearby area, populated primarily by Christians, would continue to grow during the French Mandate. It would be liberated by Australian soldiers from the Axis powers, run by Vichy France in this case, and would gain its independence in the aftermath of the Second World War. And after a brief period of a few decades of prosperity and tranquility, it became known as the Paris of the Middle East, but would eventually devolve into a brutal civil war between Muslims and Christians, followed by a long period of stagnation and economic and political unrest. Hopefully, the future of this city will be as glorious as its past, not as terrible as its present. Next on the list, and really the last city on the list, is in Europe, and that is Argos, dating back to 1700 BCE. I'm going to move away from the Middle East, which I've been focusing too much on, and move to the oldest continuously inhabited city in Europe. While not as famous as Athens or Sparta, this city was a prominent trading post and military bastion during the Mycenaean era of Greek history. This was at a time so ancient that the ancient Athenians thought it was ancient themselves. If you've ever read the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War, you probably have heard of this city. To what extent the Iliad is true, or to what extent is mythical, is still up for debate. I personally view it as more of a legendary story, but nonetheless, the city of Argos would be seen as a cultural center point for the Greeks during the classical era, to look back on years of yonder. And that essentially is my list of some of the most important continuously inhabited cities in the world, or more accurately, the Middle East and its surrounding areas. I want to fully acknowledge that there are plenty of other cities that could have been added onto the list, and this is by no means comprehensive. And because it was so heavily focused on the Middle East, I think that there's room to add for new videos that I'll be talking about other portions of the world in regards to. But in the meantime, I'd appreciate if you subscribe to my channel, or at the very least, give it a like, give it a hate comment, something. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.